I want to talk today mostly about meditation and my experience with meditation, and also how, based on the science and the experiences of many, many people, it can really change your experience of the world. And the way I like to put it is it can upgrade your mind's operating system. So this is very sensitive. Let me press next. Huh. So let me start with my journey. So I've been in Japan about 10 years, and my journey into meditation started like many others. I was stressed at work, so picked up an app, Headspace, started meditating 10, 15 minutes a day, and very quickly, probably after 2 or 3 weeks, realized that there was some reduction in my stress. So I found it immediately effective and continued doing that and really just stuck to it. I made it into a routine and uh, honestly stuck with the app probably for like 5 years, doing sessions from 20 minutes to 40 minutes. Uh, After about 4 or 5 years of doing that, I was also working in Japan, felt an itch to travel, so I quit my job, and that's when my meditation practice sort of took a different turn. And I was in Costa Rica, I was in Thailand, and went to a bunch of different places, and I was on several different meditation retreats. I also was into plant medicine, fasting, a lot of different experiences, really just exploring uh, myself and just sort of perhaps looking for something as well. After about a year of that, I sort of got a little bit tired of the travel and said, okay, what do I do now? And I ended up starting my own business, which was a coaching business online. Did that for about 3, 4 years. Of course, it started the pandemic. I was still doing this business and honestly very unhappy with the way it was going. It was very stressful and only got worse. Led to some pretty severe burnout and a moment where I didn't really know what to do next. And so, as I was still running the business, I decided to go on a few more meditation retreats, basically going back to back 20 days in silence. And that sort of clicked. And I said, okay, well, I'm really not happy doing this. There's no point in just prolonging my suffering. And so I ended up quitting, getting rid of my startup, actually sold some of it, and then moved on. And as part of that experience, I actually had some post-traumatic stress and a lot of other issues surface, which tends to happen when you have sort of a big change in your life, whether it's a death or a loss of some sort. And that required me to go beyond meditation and to really look at other different types of practices, from somatic therapy to yoga to breath work and all sorts of other things. And so all of that in turn inspired me to start Tokyo Mindfulness, which is what I've been doing for the last year, and sharing a lot of these practices, doing meditation retreats and events and that sort of thing. So my philosophy now and my approach isn't just about meditation. It's actually very integrated. I think there's a lot of different skills, different purposes for these different practices. So, for example, doing plant medicine, doing ayahuasca in South America or Costa Rica is very powerful. However, that's not something that's very sustainable on a daily basis. So perhaps meditation or yoga can sort of make up for that, but they have different uses and they are both useful in their own way. There are meditation teachers, for example, one retreat I went to, the Vipassana retreats you guys might be familiar with. The teacher Goenka, he started it in the 70s, 80s, and there's many centers around the world. And so he was very obese, right? He had diabetes, master meditator, but wasn't super healthy. And my point in saying that is, just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean you're good at another thing, right? Just because you're a good meditator doesn't mean you know how to communicate with your wife, or doesn't mean you're a good employee. Just because you are, healthy and exercise doesn't mean that your mind isn't just racing all the time. So there are different skills, and I believe in growing them together. That's a little bit about my philosophy now. So turning to the big question and sort of more into meditation. Um, in the last year, especially from doing meditation sessions weekly, I found that people are looking for something when they come to meditation. So perhaps they're unhappy at work, maybe they can't sleep, maybe something tragic just happened. I sum all this up as looking for happiness, looking for contentment. And you may have your own definition of what happiness is. Obviously, it's a very big topic, but my definition is, this is a measure of how satisfied and content we are in the present moment without any added judgment or craving. So that is my definition of happiness. And it can come from simply, sorry, I left to admit some people into the room here. It can come from many sources, but oftentimes we are chasing it and looking for it in all the wrong places. So we know that, our current operating system, if you can call it that, is spent lost in thought, depending on who you ask, depending on the day, depending on the person. Probably half the time we're thinking about something that maybe we don't need to be thinking about. 95% of those thoughts are actually repetitive. So we have the same sort of loops that we go, the same sort of stories that we replay in our minds. And 80% of those thoughts can be actually judgmental or negative in some way. So it seems like, our current sort of way of functioning doesn't make happiness come very naturally, at least for many of us. So the other part of this is just, asking the question, like, who is happy, and going deeper into this idea. Well, we know that the happiness doesn't come from necessarily external places. So you can be the richest person in the world. Obviously, you can be a very unhappy person. You can also have nothing and be very happy. So there's something beyond, something other than our external achievements, goals, and possessions that leads to happiness. Another part of this is this idea that perhaps there is a baseline level of happiness. And there's been a lot of studies on this. So for example, lottery winners, after winning the lottery, $10 million, $100 million, there's obviously a spike in their happiness, but after a few weeks, after a few months, it actually goes back down to their baseline. So they report feeling just as happy as they were, before they won the lottery. Similarly, when you have someone lose a limb or both limbs or all limbs, they're obviously not very happy when that happens. And for some time, it's very difficult. But just like the lottery winners, their happiness level goes back to baseline. So it seems like for many of us that our happiness levels are somehow determined, or there's somehow a set point to that. And no matter what we do, we keep going back to that. I found this graphic, and I think someone just gave the example of wanting to buy a Tesla and then getting the Tesla and you're unhappy, then you get the new model and you're still, unhappy after some time. So the question then is, can we change our baseline? Can we change our baseline level of happiness? And this is Mingyur Rinpoche. He's a Tibetan Buddhist, and a lot of studies on meditators. There's a lot of studies been done on him, and one of the most interesting studies, and one of the main ways that I believe meditation can change its baseline, is by quieting something called the default mode network. So this is going into a little bit of the science. So the default mode network is a series of brain regions that turn on when you're not actively focused on a task. So when you are sitting at your desk, you don't have anything to do, your mind starts wandering off, right? For most of us, we start thinking about the past or the future, worrying, ruminating, etc. And what studies found on meditators is that when you're meditating, this region quiets down. And not only during meditation, but after meditation. So it actually causes structural changes in your brain to where your default mode network is less active. So an example of this would be, if you're at a party and you're in a group of people and you tell a joke and your joke is not funny and no one laughs, and then you sort of feel a little bit embarrassed about it, but people sort of keep talking, move on. Everyone forgets about it except you. You're still thinking about this terrible joke that you told. You can't sleep at night. It keeps popping up in your head. So that is an example of an overactive default mode network. And people that have depression, anxiety, PTSD have been shown to have overactive default mode networks. There is a meditator, you can look him up, Daniel Ingram, very advanced meditator. They've done studies on him. and his default mode network is off by default, like pretty much always. He can consciously turn it on, but in a state of wakeful rest, where many of us would be sort of wandering off, nothing is happening in his mind. So you can imagine that's a very sort of peaceful place and state to be in. Of course, that doesn't happen overnight. So many of these studies are done or have been done on mindfulness meditation practices. So mindfulness of the breath, mindfulness of the body, and some of the heart practices like loving kindness and forgiveness meditation. There haven't been so many studies done on like mantra meditations and transcendental meditation, but there are a few. So in these studies, they found that 13, 15 minutes a day for a couple months is enough to start to see these changes. So there is some minimum threshold that you need to achieve before you can experience these results. The second way meditation, I believe, changes your baseline happiness is helping you let go of your ego. And your ego is this part of you that feels separate from others, right? And is really driven by fear and by craving and wanting more. There's a great quote here by Eckhart Tolle: as long as the egoic mind is running your life, you cannot truly be at ease, you cannot be at peace or fulfilled except for brief intervals when you obtained what you wanted, when a craving has just been fulfilled. Since the ego is a derived sense of self, it needs to identify with external things. It needs to be both defended and fed constantly. So how does meditation actually help you let go of your ego? Good question. Oops. So as you start to meditate, you begin to deepen your levels of awareness. And in the very beginning, you sit down and you start to notice very clearly just the content of what's going on, you know, what you had for breakfast or some conversation you had. All these different thoughts and objects and images are just sort of popping up. So it's very surface level. Once you go down a step further, you can start to label or see what these what's behind these thoughts. And there's often a process, right? So these sort of thoughts are judging thoughts, or maybe you're planning or organizing something, right? Or maybe you're ruminating, or maybe they're sort of anxious thoughts. So you're starting to see sort of the process behind what creates the content. As you go a step deeper, you start to notice the quality of your mind, the quality of your heart, the quality of your body. You know, maybe you're feeling a little bit tight and closed in, and that experience really influences the processes and the content of what's going on. You notice when you're more open and spacious that the content and processes are different. And so you start to get another level of awareness. And even if you get to just that amount of realization in you know, a few weeks of meditation, that's enough to let go of a lot of sort of ego and clinging and attachment, and just allow you to be more present and relaxed in the moment. As you go deeper into meditation, a lot of that starts to drop away, and you start to observe the observer. You start to have this metacognition of awareness and this whole field of awareness, which you know, everything is essentially arising and passing away: the sounds, the smells, the thoughts, all the qualities and processes. But there is something stable there behind all of that. And just being aware of that is actually very, very balanced. It's very calming. And it's often described as a space of open awareness or spaciousness. And if you're in that state, and if you can get back into that state consistently, then that is very life-changing, because you can go, you know, minutes without having any wandering thoughts or a wandering mind after having done this sort of practice. And then very lastly is beyond this sort of awareness and spaciousness, you have the next level, which comes as a cessation, a stopping of perception, feeling, and consciousness. And in Buddhism, this is known as Nirodha. Basically, it's like a blip in your consciousness. You can't actually experience it because there's nothing to experience, but what happens is uh, you're basically rebooting your system. You've blacked out for a second, and then when you come back, you see all these processes sort of reboot in your mind. And depending on what tradition you follow, Theravada or Mahayana, Vajrayana practices, this leads to some initial stage of awakening. And oh wow, okay, that was interesting. What happened? And then there's an unfolding of a process there. And you sort of repeat this process over and over as you get deeper and deeper into your practice. So that's a very simple explanation. Um, so sorry. So a little bit more about awakening. This could be a whole conversation, but different traditions talk about it in different ways. Some some traditions, like Theravada tradition, is like very clear in its structure of like, here are the four foundations of mindfulness. This will lead directly to a moment of awakening. If you keep doing this, you'll go through different stages of awakening. So in the Theravada tradition, you have these four levels of awakening, which there's actually a lot written about this. There's a Reddit, there's a subreddit called Stream Entry, which is the first level of awakening. So there's plenty out there for you to research and read about. And other traditions don't talk about it as much. Zen obviously recognizes awakening, enlightenment, but doesn't really talk about any stages or path. It's just sort of something that happens more suddenly or gradually. Dzogchen doesn't really use the same terminology, but they have this idea of Rigpa, which is similar to just the sort of underlying awareness behind everything, and realizing that is an awakening. So different language for different traditions, but you'll find that this is talked about in most Buddhist traditions in some way, and it's not at least if you have some roadmap. So this is sort of my philosophy, and the reason I like the Theravada style is because when you have some roadmap, you can kind of see where you're at, and sort of where you're going along, as long as you don't get too attached to those labels. So we can talk more about that if you guys have questions, but that's a little bit about some of the different ways in which traditions look at awakening. And by the way, the word, awakening or enlightenment or nibbana, like, they're sort of loaded terms and there's different definitions, but by many definitions, like, you can actually achieve some of these states in a 10-day retreat, or practicing consistently for a few months. So it's not something that you don't necessarily have to go into a cave for 10 years. So moving on, kind of a interesting slide to end on here soon, but the dangers of meditation. So obviously dissolving your ego, quieting your default mode network, these are all very positive. These can result in very positive changes, personality changes. You're less identified with your ego, you're more calm, you're more relaxed, you're less reactive. However, there are some dangers. So there's two ways I think about this. One is in terms of your actual subjective experience. If you have other issues like trauma or anxiety or depression, this can exacerbate those issues if you're not emotionally and mentally stable. So in those cases, maybe stopping meditation and seeing a therapist is a good idea until you're ready to do that. Or there's other techniques like keeping your eyes open as you meditate. There's a great website called cheetahhouse.org, and the researcher, psychologist Dr. Britton, she's done a lot of research on the negative side effects of meditation and how to sort of counter that. So if you're interested in that, you can check out that website. The other way I think about this is more of a spiritual emergence. There's a book called Spiritual Emergency, which is sort of a play on words. And if you look at like a lot of shamanic traditions, how does someone become a shaman? Well, usually what happens is they'll wake up and suddenly they're very ill, they're very sick, and this can last for weeks, months, or years. So there's this period of change and confusion and sickness that comes before they accept their calling to become a shaman. And then once they do that, they go on to the community and they can sort of share their teachings. So there's this book, Spiritual Emergency and Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. It talks about these different stages of meditation that a lot of people experience. And this has been talked about for thousands of years in different traditions, including Christianity. We've got St. John of the Cross, who talks about the dark night of the soul. And there's this period of just like barren desolation where, you know, things are terrible and awful, but then you come out of that. And so there is some of that. If you are seriously embarking on some sort of spiritual journey or meditative journey, that is like part of the package. And when I say journey, I don't mean even going on a retreat. Even 20 minutes a day, like you are starting some process. So there's a story of a lady, a mom, who was using Headspace, which is like a popular meditation app, and she started experiencing this dissolution of her ego and herself. And so she couldn't, like, there were times meditating she couldn't feel her body, and then she'd feel very expansive, and her relationship to things changed. And this was very scary for her because she wasn't expecting this. And so she's like contacting customer support, right? Like, hey, like, I can't, you know, feel my body, what's going on? And then customer support responds, oh yeah, that's normal. That's just called no self in Buddhism. She's like, well, that's not what I signed up for. This is like a secular meditation app. It's supposed to help me sleep and relax. It's not supposed to, you know, dissolve myself. So, you know, the point is that even with a little bit of meditation daily, you can have these different experiences. So it's good to know that that can happen. That way, when you do, you have the resources and you can work through it, and it's not a surprise. Oh, that's okay. So the last part here, so deepening your practice. So this is general advice I've got from different teachers. It's also more or less what I do, daily practice. So if you want to deepen your meditation practice, obviously if you're just starting, you know, you've got kids, you've got a job, do what you can, 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day. If you want to deepen your practice and start experiencing some of these more drastic effects that I mentioned, doing a daily practice every day, finding time once a month, maybe on the weekends, just to sit for a longer period of time, a couple hours, 2-3 hours, finding time to do a 10-day retreat. You know, there's plenty of retreats. There's a couple centers in Japan, and getting to Southeast Asia is sometimes actually easier than doing it in Japan. Group sits, if you can find a group, it's a very different vibe. Obviously, Tokyo Mindfulness, we have our group you can check out. Reading, watching Dhamma talks. So, you know, there's all these different stories of well, like Zen stories where they're sharing a koan or they're sharing a riddle or something, and then suddenly, you know, the entire room of monks are enlightened, right? Just with like a couple words. So it's this idea that you know, starting to have some of these ideas sink in, and that allows you to, well, perhaps subconsciously start to experience things a little bit differently, and maybe when you're meditating, these concepts will make more sense as well.